Hello, everyone that is watching. Just to introduce myself, I am Garrett Bland, a junior mass communications major hailing all the way from Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a concentration in journalism. And I will be doing my leadership analysis presentation on the one and only former Representative John Lewis. May he rest in peace. God rest his soul. So before we get into the presentation, we're just going to look at our agenda here and look at the things we're going to cover in this presentation. So first, I have an overview, just basically talking about a little bit about who John Lewis was, if there's somebody out there who doesn't know. And then we're going to jump right into some of the qualities that he possessed and I found to be most impactful throughout his life. So we have four here, which is courage, his commitment to nonviolence, his vision, and his perseverance. And then at the end of the presentation, I will give my own thoughts on who John Lewis was, what I think about his qualities, and what certain things have I taken away from the way he lived his life and the way he led. So first things first, let's get into our overview. So, if you do not know, Representative John Lewis was a civil rights leader and politician who dedicated his life to fighting for justice and equality for all. He possessed many leadership qualities that made him an effective and inspiring leader. So let's see what those qualities are, shall we? Well, I guess you've already seen them, but let's tackle the first one here. So the first one I have down here is his courage. It says one of the most prominent qualities that John Lewis possessed was courage. He was a man who was not afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even in the face of great danger. Throughout his life, he faced numerous instances of violence and intimidation, but he never backed down. Whether he was facing down racist mobs or being beaten by police officers, he remained steadfast in his commitment to nonviolence and his belief in the power of peaceful protest. I also have here just a couple of facts from a couple of the articles I read, is that John Lewis had the courage, especially being evident during those marches, especially the ones in Selma in 1965 from Selma to Montgomery over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which were organized to demand voting rights for African Americans. On March 7th, 1965, known as Bloody Sunday, Lewis and other marchers were brutally beaten by state troopers as they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Lewis suffered a skull fracture and nearly died as a result of the attack. Despite this horrific violence, Lewis continued to lead the marches, and 2 weeks later, he successfully completed that march to Montgomery. Now, those marches were completed with numerous of Black figures and people that actually came to Selma from all over the country, and of course, with the one and only Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I see this as just perfect examples of being courageous, standing for what you believe in, even when you're scared. That's also a little bit of bravery, but you have to have the courage to be brave. And so I believe without his courage and without his bravery, we definitely wouldn't have literally crossed that bridge to get our voting rights. And so we're going to get into the second one here. Um, Obviously, I couldn't go without saying this one is commitment to nonviolence. We have here another key leadership quality that John Lewis possessed was his commitment to nonviolence. He was a strong believer in the power of peaceful protest and worked tirelessly to promote this philosophy throughout his life. Lewis was heavily influenced by the teachings of Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Again, that is someone who mentored him and even walked over the Edmund Pettus Bridge with in Selma. And he believed that nonviolence was the most effective way to bring about social change. So a lot of the things that people don't understand about the civil rights movement is that there were a lot of emotions coming from Black people. And a lot of people wanted to take the approach that Malcolm X or even Nelson Mandela had during apartheid, and that was to fight back with brute force. But as you can see, sometimes that just goes the wrong way. And as you can see, over the course of American history, brute force being matched with brute force just leads to more bloodshed. And that's certainly something we didn't want during this time when all we wanted was just equality. So Lewis's commitment to nonviolence was demonstrated time and time again throughout his life. For example, during the Freedom Rides of 1961, Lewis and other activists rode buses across the South to protest segregation. Again, this was a nonviolent protest. They were often met with violent opposition, but Lewis and his fellow riders refused to fight back. They remained committed to nonviolence, and their peaceful protests helped to bring about significant changes in the laws and governing segregation. So another thing that I believe is very evident about John Lewis is there's commitment. And that's something that a good leader needs, is to be committed to whatever goal they are trying to achieve. You know, it's never good to have a leader that says they want to do something, but they have no determination or they have no drive or commitment to that goal. And it's very evident in the end, once it's time to show what was completed in that time when you were supposed to complete that goal. But people like Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and Dr. Martin Luther King, they were committed to their goals. They were committed to achieving equality for Black people and doing it this way. And I believe they succeeded. Look at where we're at today. I do believe that there are still some things that need to be changed, but at the end of the day, we never would have gotten to the point we are now without John Lewis's commitment. And that is something that I believe leaders need to take away from John Lewis and his life. So the next one here, we have his vision. Now, there are different types of leaders in this world. One of them is a visionary. People like John Lewis and people like Dr. Martin Luther King, they were visionary leaders because they had the vision to see equality for people of color. And that's what they tried to achieve. So John Lewis was a visionary leader who had a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve. He was a man who believed that change was possible, and he worked tirelessly to bring his vision of more and just equitable society to fruition. Lewis was a skilled strategist who understood that change often takes time and persistence. One of the most significant examples of Lewis's vision was his role in the 1963 March on Washington. Again, probably one of the most famous and most talked about things to this day in American history. And when you think about it, I think this is when I think about what I learned in school as far as Black history, this is probably one of the only subjects or one of the only events in American history that we talked about outside of Black History Month, because it was just that big. It was that big of a moment. And of course, that's where Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So, as one of the youngest speakers at the march, Lewis called for an end to segregation and discrimination and the passage of the Civil Rights Act. He knew that his word had power to inspire others and help bring about change. And so one of the things about being a visionary leader is you have to preach your goal. You have to preach your vision to the people that are following you. And where people go wrong sometimes it's not even clear enough, or they have the vision, but they have no application of that vision. The thing is, John Lewis was a visionary, So was Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But John Lewis was a visionary, and you can see that he was applying it by speaking and marching and even running for House representative. And he achieved those things to get his vision across so that he could see it come to fruition. And so the last quality we're going to talk about is his perseverance. Now, this is a big one, and I believe as a leader, this is very, very, very important. John Lewis was a man who never gave up. He was a relentless fighter for justice and equality, and he refused to be deterred by setbacks or obstacles throughout his life. He faced numerous challenges and setbacks, but he remained committed to his goals. So that again ties in with commitment. Uh, just a while ago, we talked about commitment to nonviolence and also commitment to our goals. We also have to be committed to be perseverant. You know, I'm a very faithful man. I read the Bible almost every day. One of my favorite scriptures, or one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, is James, the book of James. And in the beginning of the book of James, about James chapter 2, it talks about perseverance. It talks about how there are going to be many trials and many storms that come throughout your life. But if you persevere, if you use what you know, if you use that knowledge, and if you just wait on the Lord, you will receive the crown of life. So that's really what life is all about, is persevering, jumping through those hoops, hurdling those hurdles, getting over those obstacles. And John Lewis did that throughout his life. Again, one of the most notable experiences, or one of the most notable examples of John Lewis's perseverance, was his fight to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For years, Lewis and other activists had been working to secure voting rights for African Americans, but their efforts were met with resistance from white supremacists and segregationalist politicians. Despite these challenges, Lewis and his fellow activists refused to give up. They organized marches and protests, met with politicians, and used their voices to demand change. Finally, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, thanks in large to Lewis's tireless efforts. So you see, you have to have the right application. Excuse me. You have to have the right application in order to achieve your goals. But it's always going to take perseverance, because there's always going to be things that gets in the way. There's always going to be obstacles. There's always going to be somebody that's telling you no. And as a leader, you need to set an example for your followers and say, we're going to push back on this. But again, they were committed to nonviolence. So it's beautiful to see how they didn't have to stoop to the level of white supremacy and people who were angry at them, but they still wanted to achieve something monumental, which they did. And so now I'm going to have my personal thoughts on John Lewis. Now, throughout this presentation, I gave little seeds here and there, but I kind of just wanted to touch on how special John Lewis was to me. I never met John Lewis, but I always heard about him. I actually did not really understand fully who John Lewis was until I watched the movie Selma that came out, I believe, a few years ago. I'm not sure if it's been a decade yet since it came out, but I remember my mom telling me about John Lewis, and then watching the movie and asking my mom if that was the same person, and just remembering all those stories about who John Lewis was. And the things that I've taken away from John Lewis is definitely perseverance. You know, I've faced a lot of trials and a lot of tribulations throughout my life, but I know if I'm going to do what I want to do in this only life that I have to persevere through obstacles and barricades that are in my road, that are in the way. Also, just being a visionary leader, I have to be able to see clearly what it is I want for my life. And those who are trying to support me understand what I want for my life as well. As far as commitment to nonviolence, I'm not a violent person, but and I agree with the nonviolence point of view. But I also admire the commitment. And that's one of the things that a leader has to do, is be committed to whatever they're trying to do. They can't be flip-flopping between things that they want to do. You have to stay committed to one thing, one goal at a time. And of course, being courageous, being able to take risks, being able to face your fears. You got to have the courage to do that, because eventually you're going to have to look at yourself in the mirror and look and see what's in your way. What is in your way? Maybe sometimes you're in your own way, and you have to be courageous enough to tell yourself to get out your own way. And so those are some of the things I learned from John Lewis. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. And again, one last thing is that when we talk about John Lewis, I cannot uh, end this presentation without talking about that Good Trouble speech. And it's so impactful because John Lewis tells us to get in trouble, but the good kind of trouble. And I believe what he means by that is to make some noise. Let people know that you're coming. Let people know that you're on the rise. And sometimes it may be controversial, but as long as it's ethical, nobody can stop you. There's always going to be people who have something to say, but nobody can stop you if you have these 4 qualities. So once again, thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.